What if the shadows around you weren't just darkness? What if they had a mind of their own, waiting for the right moment to reveal something that would send chills down your spine? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see the world around you. It was just another quiet night, or so I convinced myself. The kind of night where the world feels suspended in time, where every minute stretches like an eternity, and the world outside is muffled by the thick, dark blanket of night. The wind howled through the trees, its eerie wail making its way into the cracks of my apartment windows. But that sound was far from unsettling. It was simply a part of the night. The house groaned in its old age, and the occasional rustling of leaves outside added to the familiar chorus of the evening. Everything felt routine, comfortable, safe. I lived alone in a small apartment tucked away in an aging building on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the most glamorous place, but it had character. The faded wallpaper, the creaky floors, and the ever-present smell of dust and mildew were all a part of its charm. I had grown used to the creaks of the building and the constant hum of the old radiator in the corner. In fact, they had become comforting sounds to me, signals that everything was as it should be, safe, normal. But tonight, something was different. I sat at my desk, the only light in the room coming from the dull glow of my laptop screen. My fingers hovered over the keys as I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept wandering. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating, as if it were waiting for something to happen. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was an odd heaviness in the air tonight. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that had been forgotten to return. I turned away from the laptop and glanced out of the window, hoping the view would break the tension. But all I could see was the black void of the night, the faint outline of the city's skyline barely visible against the darkened sky. The world outside seemed far removed from the strange feeling creeping over me, but the more I sat in the stillness, the more my unease grew. There was something in the air tonight, something I couldn't explain. And then I heard it. A whisper. I didn't recognize it at first. It was so faint that I thought it might be the wind, or maybe just the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. But it was more than that. It was deliberate. It was too specific, too direct. I turned my head toward the direction of the sound, my pulse quickening. My eyes scanned the room, but there was nothing. Nothing that could explain the feeling that had begun to flood my chest. I shook my head. It was nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks on me. I was tired. I had been working late, and my mind was simply overwhelmed. It was probably nothing more than my overactive mind making something out of nothing. I turned back to the desk, forcing myself to focus on the screen. I was just about to type when I heard it again. "Mark!" My heart skipped a beat. I froze. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to type. It wasn't a voice from outside my head. It was clear. It was distinct. It was my name. I stood up, my body stiff with unease, as I slowly scanned the room. There was nothing there. No one. Just the same old furniture, the same familiar clutter, the same silence, the same shadows dancing along the walls as the light flickered above. "Mark!" This time the whisper was louder, closer. It sounded as if it was right next to my ear, and yet I couldn't see anyone. I looked around, my eyes darting from corner to corner, checking the shadows that stretched across the walls. I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, but who, or what, was there? I froze. Every inch of my body screamed for me to leave the room, to run, but my feet refused to move. The voice had paralyzed me, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense it became. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, deeper, pulling away from the light like living things. The air felt colder, thicker, as if it were absorbing every ounce of warmth from the room, replacing it with a strange, unnatural chill. I backed toward the door, my eyes never leaving the dark corners of the room. My hands were cold, trembling slightly as I reached for the doorknob. I didn't want to turn it. I didn't want to open the door. The air in here was suffocating, heavy with the weight of something ancient, something watching me, something that didn't want me to leave. And then I heard it again. "Come closer!" The words weren't a whisper this time. They were a command, soft but unyielding. It was as if the shadows themselves were beckoning me, pulling me toward them. My legs felt weak, as if they were no longer under my control. Every part of my body screamed for me to escape, but my feet refused to budge. It was like I was being held in place, trapped by the very air around me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the voice stopped. For a moment there was nothing. Silence. But that silence was deafening. The weight of the air was unbearable. The room seemed to be closing in on me, the shadows stretching toward me, growing longer, darker, and thicker. The walls felt as if they were bending inward, pressing on me, as if they were alive and moving. I felt it then. A presence, not a person, not a creature, but a presence, a force. It was like the very air in the room had become dense with it, and the longer I stayed, the more it pressed against me, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I turned again to the corner of the room, where the darkness seemed to pool, where the shadows were so thick they seemed almost tangible, and there it was, a figure. At first it was barely noticeable, a shifting silhouette at the edge of my vision, but as I stared at it, it became clearer, more defined, the shape of a person, but not fully human. It was like the shadows themselves had come to life, taking shape, contorting into something that almost resembled a person but wasn't quite. It moved, slowly, inexorably, toward me. I stepped back, my body trembling with fear. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear anything else. My breath quickened, shallow and panicked. The figure was coming closer, and I was rooted to the spot, unable to do anything but watch. The room felt colder still, and the shadows stretched longer, filling the corners with their dark presence. And then it spoke again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. "You can't escape us." The voice wasn't from the figure. It was everywhere. It was in the walls. It was in my mind. It was in the very air I breathed. And I realized then, with a sickening certainty, that I had made a terrible mistake. I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and now I couldn't escape it. If this gave you chills, make sure to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Let's see if they can handle what's coming next. The night was still young, but every passing minute felt like an eternity. The silence in the room was no longer comforting. It was oppressive, thick. It pressed against me like a physical weight, as if the very air had become heavy with some unseen force. The whispers hadn't stopped, but now they were different. No longer soft and distant, they had become sharper, more insistent, as if they were growing stronger with every breath I took. I had spent the past few hours trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. It was just a trick of the mind, a result of exhaustion, But the more I tried to ignore the whispers, the more real they seemed. And it wasn't just the voices. The very room around me seemed to be changing. The walls, the corners, the shadows, they all seemed to move, stretch, and bend in unnatural ways. I had never been particularly superstitious. I didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, not really. But now, standing in the middle of my apartment, I wasn't so sure. I had tried to shake off the strange feeling that had clung to me since I first heard the voice calling my name, but it wouldn't let me go. It lingered like a cloud, hanging over me, making every movement feel like it was happening in slow motion. I stood in the center of the room, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. I could hear the whispers again, faint but growing louder, as though they were closing in on me. I tried to focus, to reason with myself. Maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps the creaking of the old building settling. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was in this room with me. Something that I couldn't see but could feel, and the longer I stood there, the more I realized that it wasn't just the walls that were closing in on me. It was the shadows themselves. The shadows were the worst part. They had never bothered me before. I was used to them, the way they stretched and warped with the changing light. But tonight, they were different. Tonight, they felt alive. They seemed to move on their own, twisting and bending, crawling along the walls and floor, like something with a mind of its own. I turned my head, and in the corner of my vision, I saw them shift, just for a moment, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I quickly looked away, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, didn't go away. The shadows were still there, lurking at the edges of my vision, moving just outside the reach of the light. I could feel them, like cold fingers, brushing against the back of my neck, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. The whispers grew louder. Now they weren't just words, they were thoughts, my thoughts. At least that's what they felt like. They weren't random whispers anymore. They were direct, purposeful. They were speaking to me in a way that I couldn't understand, yet somehow I could feel them in my very soul. They were tapping into something deep inside me, something primal, and it terrified me. Come closer. The voice wasn't like before. It wasn't soft or far away. It was clear, direct, and it was calling to me. I couldn't help it. My feet began to move, as though on their own accord. Step by step, I found myself walking toward the center of the room, toward the shadows that had once been so innocuous. It wasn't like I wanted to move. It was more like I had no choice, like I was being pulled, dragged, inch by inch toward the darkness. The room seemed to shrink with each step I took. The walls pressed in, the air grew colder, and the shadows deepened, folding into themselves, stretching longer, creeping across the floor like a living thing. I reached the center of the room, and it felt as though I had stepped into a different world. The room was no longer just a room. It was something else. It was a place that existed outside of time, outside of reality, and I was trapped within it. The whispers were louder now, filling my head, drowning out everything else. They weren't just calling me anymore. They were all around me, inside me, pressing against my thoughts. I couldn't make sense of them. The words were jumbled, overlapping, echoing in my skull like 1,000 voices speaking at once. You're not alone. I stopped in my tracks, the words freezing me in place. The voice wasn't just calling to me anymore. It was inside me, moving through my thoughts, slipping into the cracks of my consciousness like a poison. The room seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing with the same rhythm as my own heart. The shadows were no longer just on the walls. They were moving, swirling, circling around me, closing in. And then, I saw it. A figure. It was so faint at first, just a shadow in the corner of my vision. But as I stared at it, the figure became clearer. It was a person, or at least it looked like a person. But something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The shape was blurry, distorted, like it was made of smoke or shadow, flickering in and out of focus. The figure moved toward me, slow and deliberate, as though it knew I was watching, as though it knew that I couldn't move, couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, constricted, as if the air had been stolen from my lungs. The figure got closer, its features becoming clearer, but still, there was something unnatural about it. The face. It was too smooth, too featureless. It was like looking at a face that had been erased, wiped away, leaving behind nothing but an empty void. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me, and in that moment, I realized there were no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just smooth, featureless skin, and yet I could feel it watching me. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. It was as though the figure was both here and not here, existing in two places at once, one foot in this world and one foot in something else entirely. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed, my body locked in place by the presence of something that wasn't human, something that shouldn't have been here. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching me. And then, the voice came again, but this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was clear. It was loud. It was right next to my ear. "You can't escape." The words sent a jolt through my body. My heart raced. My chest tightened, and I fought with every ounce of strength I had to break free from whatever hold this thing had on me. But it was like trying to fight against the air itself. It wouldn't let me go. It wouldn't let me move. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel the coldness emanating from it. It was like a deep, ancient chill, a cold that didn't belong in this world. The closer it got, the more I felt like I was being swallowed by the darkness. The shadows stretched out, reaching for me, curling around my legs, my arms, pulling me into the abyss. "Come closer, Mark." The voice called again, but this time it was not just a voice. It was a presence, a force that filled the room, a force that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The figure was now right in front of me, and I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped. The figure raised its hand, and in that moment I realized that it wasn't just a figure at all. It was something far worse. It was the darkness itself, the thing that had been watching me, waiting for me, and now it had me. What do you think is happening to me? Can you imagine what's coming next? Comment below and share your thoughts. If you're brave enough, hit the like button and share this with someone who can handle the terror lurking in the dark. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. My heart was racing, each beat pounding in my ears, but the world around me was utterly still. I was frozen, not just by fear, but by the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. The figure, the darkness itself, had come so close that I could feel its presence in every fiber of my being. I could still sense it, even though it had disappeared. That cold, suffocating weight that had settled on me, that ancient, oppressive force that had surrounded me, was still there, lingering, watching. I should have run. I should have screamed. I should have done something. But my body wouldn't obey. My feet were rooted to the floor, my arms heavy by my sides. I was trapped in place, caught in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. The more I tried to move, the more it felt like the room was closing in on me, like the walls were pressing in from all sides, and I was becoming smaller, insignificant, swallowed whole by the dark presence that surrounded me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the air felt thick, as though I were breathing in something that wasn't oxygen. It had substance. It had weight. It tasted like fear. The room was different now. It wasn't just an apartment anymore. It had become something else, a liminal space that existed between this world and another. The walls felt like they were closing in, not just physically, but in a deeper, more profound way, as though they were closing off the space I had once known. The light from the lamp flickered erratically, casting long distorted shadows across the walls that seemed to twitch and writhe like living creatures. I could hear the floorboards creaking beneath me, but it was different this time. It wasn't the creaking of an old building settling. It was something else, something alive. I tried to move again, this time forcing my legs to obey, but the floor felt like it was made of wet sand, as though the very ground beneath me was shifting, changing, becoming something unstable and dangerous. I staggered forward, my hand reaching for the door, desperate to escape. But when I turned the handle, it didn't budge. It felt locked. The door that had always been my exit, my escape, was now a barrier, a wall between me and whatever lay beyond. A voice echoed through the room, soft at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "You can't leave, Mark." It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even a voice from outside of me. It was a thought, a presence in my mind, slipping into the cracks of my consciousness, filling the gaps between my thoughts. I could hear it in the silence, feel it pressing against my mind, against my will. The figure was gone, but I could feel it. Its presence was still there, lingering, watching from the edges of my mind. I could almost hear it breathing, but not with lungs. It was the very air that breathed me in, the walls that pressed against me. The space had become alive, and it was closing in. I turned away from the door, my pulse quickening again. There was no escape. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. There was nowhere to go. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking, my chest heaving as I struggled to breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear at my skin, to claw my way out of this nightmare. But there was no way out. There was no escape. And then I saw it. The shadows that had been lurking in the corners of the room, twisting, stretching, creeping, were no longer just shadows. They were something more. They were solid now, dense, thick, as though the darkness itself had become physical, had materialized into something I could touch, something I could feel. The shadows formed into shapes, twisting and warping until they became figures, indistinct at first, but slowly taking shape. The room was filled with them now, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, all around me, moving in ways that defied logic, that defied the laws of nature. They weren't human. They were something else, something ancient and primal, their forms distorted and ever-shifting, flickering in and out of existence like dark flames. But they were real. I could feel them. One of the figures moved toward me, slowly, relentlessly. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted as though it were being squeezed shut by invisible hands. The figure moved closer, its shape flickering, its form twisting into something that I couldn't comprehend. It had no face, no features, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, empty, and all-knowing. It was a presence, a force. "You shouldn't have seen us, Mark." The voice came again, not from the figure, but from all of them, from every corner, every shadow, every flickering shape that surrounded me. It was everywhere, filling the room, filling my mind. It wasn't a voice. It was an invasion, a presence, a thing that had always been there, always watching, always waiting. The shadows closed in tighter, the figures merging together into one swirling mass of darkness. I could feel them. I could feel them reaching for me, their tendrils stretching out, brushing against my skin, curling around my limbs, pulling me toward them. The air grew colder still, and the room seemed to grow darker, as if the light were being sucked away, as though the very concept of light had no place here. We are always here. The words echoed in my mind, resonating with a deep, primal fear. It wasn't a voice that could be fought or reasoned with. It was the sound of inevitability. It was the sound of something that had always been, something that would never leave. It was the sound of death itself, but not in the way I had always imagined it. It was the death of the world, of time, of reality itself. It was the death of everything I had ever known. The figure was right in front of me now, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't just in the room. It was the room. It was the walls, the floor, the air, the shadows. It was everything, and I was nothing. I was a speck of dust, a fleeting thought, caught in the grasp of something ancient and terrible. I reached out, but my hands were trembling too violently to do anything. I wanted to run, but my legs were too weak to carry me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. I was paralyzed, trapped in a prison of my own mind, caught in a nightmare that had no end. And then, it happened. The figure raised its hand, and the room seemed to collapse around me. The walls folded in, the floor disappeared, and the very air seemed to vanish into the darkness. There was no escape. There was no room left to breathe, to think, to fight. Everything had been consumed by the shadows. You belong to us now. The words were the last thing I heard before the world went black. What happened to Mark? Was this the end? Or is there something even worse waiting for him in the darkness? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives for more terrifying stories. And make sure to hit the bell icon, because the darkness is always lurking, waiting to reveal itself again.